When she asked where they were going and why, Milman Parry's daughter Marian would recall, "My father explained that Yugoslavia was an uncivilized country at the edge of the world, on the border of the Slavic wilderness which stretched from the Adriatic to Alaska. Since hardly anyone could read or write, Yugoslavians still had retained their oral poetry and their ancient native national civilization. There were still heroes and heroic acts, and the ancient heroes were celebrated in ballads by guzlars, or bards, who knew by heart so much poetry that if it were written down it would fill libraries. But the whole thing depended, my father explained, on the fact that they couldn't write it down. As soon as literacy becomes common in a country, everyone gets lazy. They don't bother to learn things by heart anymore, and poetry is no longer a part of their daily life." In 1934 and 1935, Parry spent 15 months in Yugoslavia, driving his black Ford sedan from town to town with his young assistant, Albert Lord. They stopped at village coffee houses, spread word they were looking for local singers, recorded the songs they sang while strumming their rude, raspy, one-stringed guzles. For a few days or a week or two, Parry would stay, then head off for the next town, for Gatsko or Kulushin, Bihać or Novi Pazar. In that hard-scrabble, mostly mountainous backcountry, of roads rutted and electricity scarce, of dialects, religions, ancient wars, and tribal resentments all butting up against one another, they struggled with equipment and supplies and bed-bug-infested village inns. They powered their recording instrument with a battery charged by the engine of the Ford, shipped over from the States. Along with their native translator, Nikola, they'd periodically return to Dubrovnik, in a Croatian corner of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, where Parry's wife, daughter, and son awaited them. Then the Parry house, halfway up the hill above the city, with its fine views of the harbor and the sea, became headquarters of almost military stamp, as transcribers set to work, typewriters clattering, taking down the words of the old songs. In the end, Parry would gather half a ton of 12-inch aluminum discs, phonograph records, the size of old vinyl LPs but in white metal, filled with a young nation's and an old world's cultural tradition. But Parry was interested in them not primarily for what they said of Bosnia, Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, and elsewhere in the Balkans, but for what they might reveal, by analogy, of the older world of ancient Greece that had produced Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Finally, in a town 1,900 feet up into the mountains of northern Montenegro, an old man named Avdo Medjedovic, singer of tales of weddings and war that took days and days to tell, led Parry to conclude that in him they had found their own living Homer. In September 1935, the Parrys and young Albert Lord returned to America. On November 16th, Parry, back at Harvard, where he was assistant professor of Greek, and Lord was a recent graduate, wrote his sister that his wife was just then in Los Angeles. He gave her mailing address, which was that of his financially distraught mother-in-law. On November 17th, Parry was to give a talk on Yugoslav folk songs at Harvard. On the 18th, he met with a student and reported on his progress. A day or two later, he left for the West Coast. On December 3rd, in a Los Angeles hotel room with his wife, a bullet fired from a handgun, said to have become entangled in his luggage as Parry rummaged through it, struck him in the chest and nicked his heart. He died later that day. He was 33. When hotel employees responded to Mrs. Parry's call, they assumed she had killed her husband. She was the only other person in their suite. The police, however, concluded otherwise, that it was an accident. No autopsy was performed, no charges were brought. Some would suspect that Parry had committed suicide. Later, among Parry's own children, that their mother had killed him was regarded as a real possibility. Maybe in one of her fits of fierce, irrational rage, or maybe as cool-headed revenge for real or imagined infidelities. or other hurts he'd inflicted on her over the years.